The scent of old sins clung to the confessional, a familiar perfume of stale regret and whispered desperation. Father Gabriel Costa sat shrouded in the latticed dark, the scent of frankincense and myrrh, a thin veil over the metallic tang of memory. He was a ghost in his own life, haunting the sacred spaces where forgiveness was currency. A currency he could dispense to others, but never afford for himself. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." The voice on the other side of the screen was thin, reedy. Mrs. Agnelli confessing her weekly trifles, gossip about a neighbor, a flash of envy at a friend's new coat. Gabriel's hands resting on his knees were steady, his voice a low, soothing baritone as he offered counsel. "God's mercy is a boundless ocean, Maria. Say 10 Hail Marys and trust in his grace." But as she shuffled away, her soul unburdened, Gabriel's own remained a leaden weight in his chest. His grace. He hadn't felt it in 10 years. Not since the night he'd traded God's grace for the cold finality of a bullet. He stepped out of the confessional, the cavernous quiet of St. Michael the Archangel wrapping around him. The church was his sanctuary and his prison, a brick-and-mortar penance in the heart of Chicago's Little Italy. Sunlight, fractured by the stained glass depiction of St. Michael casting Lucifer from heaven, painted jewel-toned bruises on the stone floor. It was in this light, this holy, broken light, that Gabriel tried to piece together the man he was from the monster he had been. His gaze drifted to the back pew. A man sat there, a silhouette against the heavy oak doors. He wasn't praying. His head was up, posture coiled with a predator's stillness that didn't belong in a house of worship. Gabriel's training, the instincts he prayed daily to suppress, screamed a warning. The man wore a tailored black suit, too sharp for this working-class parish, and his hands, resting on the back of the pew in front of him, bore a faint, familiar tattoo on the webbing between thumb and forefinger. The twin-headed eagle of the Costa family. His family. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced the fragile peace Gabriel had cultivated. He turned away, his jaw tight, and began the ritual of extinguishing the votive candles. Each hiss of dying flame was a whisper from his past. He had been 16 when he'd gotten that tattoo, his skin burning under the needle, his father's proud hand on his shoulder. He was a soldier then, a killer. Now he was a shepherd. But the wolf was always there, sleeping just beneath the cassock. The next morning, the threat was no longer a silent watcher in the pews. It was a greasy, profane stain on holy ground. Tucked behind the dumpster in the church's alley, he found them. Small glassine bags dusted with a powdery white residue. Heroin. A few feet away, a parishioner's son, a boy named Leo who had just served as an altar boy last Sunday, was being cornered by two older youths. Gabriel didn't recognize them, but he recognized their swagger, the cold entitlement in their eyes. They were dealers, marking their new territory. "That's enough," Gabriel's voice cut through the alley's morning quiet. It wasn't loud, but it carried the chilling authority of his old life. The two youths turned, sneering. "Get lost, Padre. This ain't your business." The leader, a wiry kid with dead eyes, took a step toward Leo. Gabriel moved without thinking. It wasn't the movement of a priest. It was the fluid, economical motion of a predator closing distance. He didn't raise his hands. He simply placed himself between them and Leo, his body a living shield, his eyes the color of storm clouds locked onto the leaders. "Everything that happens on this ground is my business," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "You will leave this boy alone. You will take your poison off my property, and you will not return." For a moment the youth held his ground, fueled by bravado. But then he saw it. Something in the priest's gaze flickered. A glimpse of the abyss. He saw a man who understood violence not as a tool of intimidation, but as a language. The dealer's sneer faltered. He shoved his companion. "Let's go. Place is dead anyway." As they retreated, Gabriel's composure crumbled. He leaned against the brick wall, his breath coming in ragged bursts, the adrenaline leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He had stared down a street-level dealer and won, but he had done it by summoning the devil he had sworn to renounce. Leo looked at him, his young face a mixture of fear and awe. "Thanks, Father." Gabriel placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his own hand trembling slightly. "Stay away from them, Leo. They offer nothing but death." The boy nodded and ran off, leaving Gabriel alone in the alley, with the discarded bags and the ghost of the man he used to be. That night's sleep offered no escape. It dragged him back, kicking and screaming, to a rain-slicked alley in Naples 10 years ago. The rain fell in cold, relentless sheets, washing the grime of the city into the gutters. He was 22, but he felt ancient. The target was a rival capo, Francesco Gallo, a man who had broken the code, who had sold information to the authorities. The order from his father was simple: make an example of him. Gabriel was the instrument, the angel of death in a black leather jacket. He moved through the shadows, his beretta a cold, comforting weight in his hand. Gallo was predictable. Every Tuesday, he visited his mistress. Gabriel waited in the alcove across from the apartment building, the rain plastering his dark hair to his scalp. He was patient. He was a hunter. The door opened. A figure emerged, huddled under a large black umbrella. The right height, the right build, the expensive overcoat. Gabriel stepped from the shadows, raising the pistol, the silencer ensuring the city's symphony would not be interrupted. 2 shots, precise and silent. A muffled thump as the body hit the wet pavement. He moved forward to confirm the kill, his face impassive. It was a job, nothing more. He kicked the umbrella aside, and his world shattered. It wasn't Gallo. It was a woman, the mistress. Her eyes, wide with the final shock of betrayal, stared up at the indifferent sky. And clutched in her hand was a small, crudely drawn picture of a flower, the kind a child makes. From the apartment window above, a small face peered out, a child's cry swallowed by the storm. He had not only killed a woman, he had orphaned a child. He had murdered a mother. Something inside him broke. The cold professionalism, the detached efficiency, it all dissolved into a nauseating wave of self-loathing. This wasn't justice. This wasn't honor. It was butchery. Gabriel awoke with a gasp. The sheets twisted around him, his face slick with sweat. He stumbled out of bed and fell to his knees on the cold wooden floor of his rectory room, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He prayed, the Latin words a desperate incantation against the images searing his mind. But the face of the dead woman was a more powerful icon than any crucifix. He knew he couldn't remain passive. The next day he went to the local police precinct. Sergeant O'Malley, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his uniform and whose face was a roadmap of cynicism, listened with half an ear. "Kids dealing drugs, Father? In this neighborhood?" "Shocking," O'Malley said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look, I'll have a patrol car swing by a couple extra times a day, but my hands are tied. Unless you've got a name, a real name, not some street punk, there's nothing I can do. These guys are ghosts." Gabriel left the station with a hollow feeling in his gut. The police were either bought or overwhelmed. The system he now served was designed to fail. He walked the streets of his parish, seeing it through new eyes. He saw the fear in the shopkeepers' faces, the mothers pulling their children closer, the furtive exchanges in shadowed doorways. The cancer was spreading, and he was a doctor with no medicine. That evening, the message became brutally personal. He found the church's poor box pried open, the meager collection of dollars and coins gone, but it wasn't the theft that chilled him. It was what was left in its place, a single, pristine, white lily. His breath caught in his throat. It was a symbol from his old life, a message of death, but also a signature. It was the flower their family, the Costa family, left as a calling card after a successful hit. A declaration. But why here? Why now? The answer came in the form of a late-night visitor. The heavy knock on the rectory door echoed the hammer blows of his past. He opened it to find a man in a dark suit, the same man from the back of the church. This time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood 2 others, their broad shoulders blocking the dim light of the street lamp. "Father Costa," the man said. His voice was smooth, cultured, but his eyes held the cold glint of polished steel. "My employer sends his regards. He understands you've been making inquiries." "Who is your employer?" Gabriel asked, his body tensing, every muscle poised for a fight he knew he couldn't win. The man smiled, a humorless slash in the darkness. "He believes family should speak for itself." He stepped aside. From the shadows of the waiting town car, a figure emerged. He was younger than Gabriel, dressed in a suit that cost more than the church's monthly budget, his dark hair styled with expensive product. He moved with a confident, predatory grace that Gabriel recognized with a sickening lurch of his stomach. It was the same walk their father had. The young man stopped under the dim porch light, his face illuminated. It was a face Gabriel saw every morning in the mirror, but twisted by a decade of cruelty and ambition. The same dark eyes, the same strong jaw. But where Gabriel's face was etched with penance, this one was smooth, arrogant, and utterly without mercy. "Hello, brother," Marco Costa said, his voice a silken threat. "It's been a long time. I trust you've been praying for me." The world tilted on its axis. The drug dealers, the indifferent police, the lily. It was all a message, a brutal, intimate message. This wasn't a random gang encroaching on his parish. This was an invasion, orchestrated by his own blood. The past he had fled across an ocean to escape had not only found him, it had come wearing his own family name. The shepherd was now face to face with a wolf born from his own pack. The air in the small rectory office crackled with a decade of unspoken resentment. Marco sat in the worn armchair, reserved for troubled parishioners, looking utterly out of place, a viper coiled on a church pew. He ran a manicured finger over the dusty crucifix on Gabriel's desk, his smile a razor's edge. "Saint Michael's," Marco mused, his voice dripping with condescending nostalgia. "Fitting, the warrior angel. Did you think you could trade your sword for a rosary and it would make a difference, Gabriele?" Gabriel stood by the window, his back to his brother, watching the neon sign of a corner tavern bleed onto the wet street. He had invited Marco inside, a strategic decision. On his own ground, he could maintain a semblance of control, however illusory. "What do you want, Marco?" "Want?" Marco laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "I have what I want. The city, the ports, the politicians. I have the empire that father built, the one you threw away. What I'm here for is clarity." He stood circling the room like a shark, his expensive cologne an invasive presence. "I'm here to offer you a choice. The same choice you made 10 years ago, only this time, you'll have to live with the consequences in the light. I'm not a part of that world anymore." "Oh, but you are," Marco hissed, his voice losing its silken edge. He stopped directly behind Gabriel. "You have our blood, you have our name, and you have my attention. I am bringing my business to this neighborhood. Your neighborhood, your flock is about to become very, very profitable for me." Gabriel turned slowly, his face a mask of clerical calm, but his eyes were burning. "You will not bring that filth near this church. You will not prey on these people." "That's where the choice comes in," Marco said, his smile returning, wider and more terrible. "You can be the good priest. You can stand at your pulpit and preach about salvation while my men sell damnation on your doorstep. You can watch your precious little altar boys turn into junkies and your faithful parishioners lock their doors in fear. You can be a shepherd who watches his flock get devoured because his God tells him to turn the other cheek." He leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. "Or you can remember who you are. You can remember what our Father taught us, that the only way to protect what is yours is with fear and with blood." The ultimatum hung in the air, suffocating and absolute. Betray his vows or betray his people. An impossible choice designed by a mind that delighted in cruelty. "God does not forgive a man who betrays his own blood, Gabriele," Marco finished, tapping 2 fingers against Gabriel's chest, right over his heart. "And neither do I." He left as quietly as he arrived, leaving Gabriel in a silence that was louder than any scream. For hours, Gabriel sat in the dark, the city's indifferent hum a counterpoint to the raging war in his soul. He prayed, but the words felt hollow, a child's rhyme against a hurricane. The God of mercy and forgiveness seemed a distant, abstract concept. The world Marco represented, the world of immediate, brutal consequence, felt terrifyingly real. His mind reeled back again, not to the night of the murder, but to the years before. He was 18 and Marco was 12. Their father, Lorenzo Costa, ruled their world from a leather throne in a smoke-filled office. Gabriel was his heir, the prodigy, a natural with a blade and a gun, possessed of a chilling calm that unnerved even seasoned soldiers. Marco was smaller, quieter. and he worshipped his older brother. He followed Gabriel everywhere, his wide eyes soaking in the casual violence and ruthless power that defined their existence. "You have to be smarter than them, Marco," Gabriel would tell him as they practiced shooting in the cavernous basement of their family home. "And harder. Never show them you're afraid. Fear is a currency, and you never, ever let them see you're poor." One afternoon, a rival faction had tried to make a move, ambushing their father's car. Gabriel, riding with him, had reacted instantly. While his father's bodyguards returned fire, Gabriel had pulled a terrified Marco from the car, shielding the boy with his own body, and with cold precision, shot both attackers. He had saved his brother's life. He was his protector, his hero. Later that night, his father had clasped his shoulder. "You have the heart of a lion, Gabriele. You will lead this family, and you," he had said, turning to a still-shaken Marco, "you watch your brother. You learn from him. He is your shield." Now the shield had become the target. Gabriel had not just abandoned his family, he had abandoned the boy who had once looked at him as if he were a god. He understood now. This wasn't just about business for Marco. It was about tearing down an idol. The days that followed were a slow-motion nightmare. Marco was true to his word. The drug trade in the neighborhood exploded. Overdoses, once a rarity, became a weekly tragedy. Young men Gabriel had baptized now stood on corners with hollowed-out eyes, their souls for sale. The police patrols O'Malley had promised were nowhere to be seen. The community retreated into itself, a collective of fear. Gabriel fought back with the only weapons he had. He organized neighborhood watch groups, but people were too afraid to participate. He opened the church doors at night as a sanctuary for homeless youth, offering soup and a cot, trying to pull them from the street's deadly embrace. He preached sermons on hope and resilience, his voice ringing with a desperate conviction he no longer felt. He was a shepherd shouting into the wind while the wolves tore his flock to pieces. The breaking point came on a cold Thursday night. He was in the church basement sorting through donated clothes when he heard a commotion upstairs in the nave. He ran up the stairs to find Leo, the young altar boy he'd saved in the alley. Crouched near the altar, his face bloody, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. Standing over him were the same two dealers from before, but this time they weren't alone. Marco's right-hand man, a brutal enforcer named Silvio, stood with them, a crowbar dangling from his hand. "The boy was stealing from the poor box again, Father," Silvio said with a mock-pious tone. "My employer doesn't approve of thieves." Gabriel's eyes were fixed on Leo's terrified, pain-filled face. He could hear the boy's ragged, shallow breaths. Something inside him, a tightly coiled spring of rage and grief he'd kept compressed for a decade, finally snapped. The priest vanished. The killer returned. He didn't speak. He didn't threaten. He moved. He launched himself at the nearest dealer, his hands striking the man's throat in a precise, disabling blow. The dealer choked, collapsing, his hands clawing at his neck. Before the second could react, Gabriel drove an elbow into his solar plexus, doubling him over, then brought his knee up into the man's face with a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. Silvio, stunned by the sudden, savage violence, finally reacted, swinging the crowbar. Gabriel ducked under the clumsy arc, stepping inside Silvio's guard. He grabbed the wrist of the arm holding the crowbar, twisting it with brutal efficiency. There was a sharp crack as the bone broke. Silvio screamed, dropping the weapon. Gabriel wasn't finished. He drove his palm up under Silvio's chin, snapping his head back, then slammed his forehead into the enforcer's nose. Silvio crumpled to the floor, a gurgling, unconscious heap. Silence descended, broken only by Leo's whimpering and the ragged sound of Gabriel's own breathing. He stood over the three broken men, his knuckles raw, his heart hammering not with fear or regret, but with a terrifying, exhilarating sense of purpose. He had just desecrated his own church with a violence more profane than any drug deal, and it felt like coming home. He knelt by Leo, his voice suddenly gentle again. "It's okay, son. You're safe." He scooped the boy into his arms, ignoring the searing pain in his own bruised hands, and carried him to the rectory, calling for an ambulance. After the paramedics had taken Leo away, after the police had come and gone, filing a report that Gabriel knew would go nowhere, he walked back into the empty, silent church. He stood before the altar, looking at the spots of blood on the sacred marble floor. He saw the truth with devastating clarity. Marco was right. His prayers were useless. His faith was a shield made of paper. To save his flock, the shepherd had to become a wolf again. He went to his room, but not to the prie-dieu where he knelt to pray. He went to the closet, to an old scuffed footlocker hidden under a pile of blankets. He hadn't opened it in 10 years. The lock was stiff, but it finally gave way with a groan. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed photographs and a worn Italian Bible, was a black leather roll. His hands were steady as he unfastened the straps. He laid it open on his bed. The polished steel of a Beretta 92 FS gleamed in the dim light. Beside it, 2 full magazines and a sound suppressor. They were his sins, made manifest in metal and oil, his inheritance. He picked up the pistol. The weight of it in his hand was familiar, comforting, and damning all at once. He was no longer just Father Gabriel. He was Gabriele Costa, son of Lorenzo Costa, the angel of death. And he had a brother to visit. This war would not be won with prayers. It would be won with bullets. And it would end where it all began, in the heart of the family. He knew then he couldn't just fight Marco in Chicago. To cut the head off the snake, you had to go to the source. He had to go to Rome. The decision, once made, settled in Gabriel's soul not with peace, but with the cold, hard certainty of a tombstone. Faith had failed. Prayer had been a shield of mist against the tidal wave. Now there was only the old arithmetic of violence and leverage. To save St. Michael's, he had to destroy the foundations that propped up his brother's throne. And those foundations were not in Chicago. They were in Rome, buried under a millennium of piety and corruption. He couldn't simply book a flight. Father Gabriel Costa of Chicago had no reason to fly to Italy. But Gabriele Costa, the ghost, had resources. 10 years ago, before he had walked into a seminary to wash the blood from his soul, he had made one final provision, a penance of foresight. He took a bus to a grimy industrial park on the outskirts of the city, the landscape a purgatory of rust and concrete. He stopped before a bank of anonymous storage units. Unit 3B. The key, a simple piece of metal he'd worn on a chain around his neck for a decade, hidden beneath his Roman collar, felt like a betrayal in his hand. The roll-up door shrieked in protest, revealing a space containing nothing but a single heavy steel footlocker. Inside was the life he had executed, a forged passport bearing a face that was his but younger, harder, under the name Alessio Bianchi, bundles of cash, vacuum-sealed and smelling faintly of plastic and regret. And at the bottom a small, leather-bound book, the ledger. His father, Lorenzo, had given it to him a month before he died. "Some things are too important for memory, Gabriele," he had said, his voice thick with cigar smoke and secrets. "This is our insurance. Our shepherd in Rome watches over us, but even shepherds must be reminded which flock is theirs." Gabriel had never understood the full weight of those words until now. He flew out of O'Hare that night, leaving Father Costa's life locked in a steel box. As the plane climbed over the glittering grid of Chicago, he felt a profound and terrible sense of freedom. He was no longer bound by vows, only by purpose. He landed in Rome as Alessio Bianchi, a ghost walking in the eternal city. The air was thick with history and exhaust. The ancient stones of the Colosseum, a monument to an empire built on the same principles as his father's: blood, loyalty, and ruthless ambition. He didn't check into a hotel. He took a small, prepaid apartment near Trastevere, a place of winding alleys and anonymous doorways where a man could disappear. For 3 days he was a hunter again. He didn't seek an audience. He watched. From cafes, from rented Fiat cars, from the throngs of tourists in St. Peter's Square, he observed his target, Cardinal Alesso Valerius, prefect of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. A man who decided who was worthy of heaven while lining his pockets with the profits of hell. Valerius was a creature of impeccable routine. Morning mass at his private chapel, administrative duties in his gilded offices, an afternoon stroll through the Vatican gardens. Always with 2 quiet, watchful assistants who moved with the coiled grace of trained bodyguards. He was untouchable, insulated by layers of protocol and piety. Gabriel knew a direct assault was impossible. The shepherd had to be lured out of his hallowed pasture. Gabriel found his leverage in the Cardinal's 1. carefully concealed vice, a weakness for ancient, pre-Christian artifacts. Through a contact from his old life, a dealer in stolen antiquities, Gabriel sent a message. An extremely rare Etruscan death mask, one believed lost for centuries, had surfaced. It was available for a private viewing, for a discerning buyer who valued discretion above all else. The meeting was set for a private gallery in a quiet piazza, late in the evening. Gabriel waited in the gallery, the space filled with the silent, judgmental eyes of marble statues. He wore a simple dark suit, the beretta a cold, hard reality pressed against the small of his back, a grotesque counterpoint to the rosary in his pocket. Cardinal Valerius arrived not in his crimson robes, but in a simple black cassock, trying to appear inconspicuous. His two assistants flanked him. The gallery owner, paid handsomely for his cooperation, led the cardinal to the back room where the mask was displayed. Gabriel stepped out of the shadows, blocking the doorway after they entered. "Your Eminence," Gabriel said, his voice calm. "Thank you for coming." Valerius turned, his face a mask of aristocratic surprise that quickly hardened into suspicion. "Who are you? I was told I was meeting a Signor Bianchi." "A name I use when I wish to travel without baggage," Gabriel replied, stepping into the light. The cardinal's eyes widened. A flicker of recognition, of shock. He was a man who rarely saw ghosts. You have your father's eyes. You are Lorenzo Costa's boy, the one who disappeared, the one who became a priest," Gabriel corrected softly, "a fact that must have caused you some inconvenience." Valerius regained his composure, his voice turning to ice. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I knew your father as a benefactor of the church, nothing more. Now, if you'll excuse me." He made to leave, but Gabriel didn't move. "I don't think you want to do that. I think you want to talk about my brother, Marco, and about the heroin he is selling to children in my parish in Chicago. The operation you are protecting." The cardinal's face became a thundercloud. "This is blasphemy. I am a prince of the church. You are a deluded, fallen man." His two assistants took a step forward. Gabriel ignored them, his eyes locked on Valerius. He pulled the small leather ledger from his jacket pocket. "Your Eminence, my father was a meticulous bookkeeper. He called this his insurance. I call it a history of transactions. Deposits into numbered Swiss accounts, dates of shipments that passed through customs without inspection, names of politicians and police chiefs who suddenly became compliant." He opened the book. Even from a distance, the cardinal could see the neat, familiar script of his old partner in crime. A sheen of sweat appeared on Valerius's upper lip. "You come into this holy city dressed as a priest, and you try to blackmail me?" Valerius spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You, a killer, a sinner who has broken every vow you ever made." "That's where you're wrong," Gabriel said, his voice dropping, filled with a terrible conviction. "I have kept my most important vow, the one I made to God the night I ran from my father's house, the vow to protect the innocent. I am here because my brother is destroying innocent lives under the shield of your holy office. You have sanctified his sins. You have no proof I'm involved." "This book is my proof," Gabriel said, holding it up, "and I am the witness. Imagine, Your Eminence, the scandal. A sitting cardinal, a man who canonizes saints, exposed as the patron of a transatlantic drug empire. Not by a journalist, but by a priest, one of your own. The story would not just discredit you. It would put a crack in the very foundation of this institution you claim to serve." The cardinal stared at him, his mind racing, seeking an escape route. "You are playing a very dangerous game. I could have you killed. An unfortunate mugging in a Roman alley. It happens all the time." A sad, weary smile touched Gabriel's lips. "You could, but my father also taught me about contingencies. If I do not check in with a certain lawyer in Zurich by noon tomorrow, this book, and a detailed sworn statement, will be delivered to every major news organization in the world. You might kill me, but you cannot kill the truth." He paused, letting the weight of his threat settle in the silent room. "You see, you are protected by centuries of tradition and faith. You are shielded by God. I, on the other hand, am a murderer and a failed priest. I have nothing left to lose. My soul is already damned, and a man with a damned soul is the most dangerous enemy of all, because he is not afraid of hell." The two assistants looked at their master, waiting for a command that didn't come. Valerius saw the truth in Gabriel's dead calm eyes. This wasn't a bluff. This was a confession, a declaration of war from a man who had already accepted his own destruction. The cardinal, for the first time in decades, felt fear, true mortal fear. "What do you want?" he finally whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You will make a phone call," Gabriel commanded, his voice now devoid of any priestly softness. It was the voice of a capo giving an order. "You will call my brother. You will tell him that the arrangement is over. The protection is gone. The shipments will stop. The authorities will no longer be blind. You will tell him that the Costa family is no longer welcome under the shadow of St. Peter's. You will cut him off. Completely." "He will be destroyed," Valerius said, aghast. "His enemies will swarm him." "Yes," Gabriel said, his face impassive. "That is the point. He will be a wolf without his mountain. Alone, vulnerable, and then I will go home, and I will deal with my brother, as a brother should." The cardinal stared at the ledger, then at the unwavering eyes of the priest who stood before him, a man who was both judge and executioner. He saw no mercy there, only a chilling, righteous fury. He was trapped, beaten, defeated not by a rival, but by the sins of his past, resurrected in the form of a son. Slowly, with a trembling hand, Cardinal Alesso Valerius reached for his phone. The shepherd, he realized with a cold horror, had been abandoned by God, and in his place stood an avenging angel, ready to cast him and all his works into the fire. The call was made. The foundation was broken. Gabriel returned to Chicago on the red-eye, the city's lights a cold, indifferent constellation below. He was no longer Alessio Bianchi, the ghost. He was Father Costa, the shepherd. But he carried the wolf home with him, nestled in the footlocker of his soul, ready to be unleashed. The effect of Cardinal Valerius's call was immediate and seismic. Marco's empire, built on the bedrock of Vatican protection, began to fracture. A major shipment was seized at the port, a miraculous tip-off to the DEA. Key political allies suddenly grew deaf to Marco's calls. The flow of money, the lifeblood of his organization, constricted. Fear, the currency Marco had so expertly wielded, began to work against him. His rivals, smelling blood in the water, started testing the edges of his territory. Gabriel saw the change on the streets of his parish. The number of dealers dwindled. The open-air drug market in the park vanished. A tentative hope began to return to the eyes of the mothers and shopkeepers. They credited the priest, their warrior angel, for this small miracle, never suspecting it was achieved not through prayer, but through a threat that had shaken the foundations of the Holy See. But Gabriel knew this was only a reprieve. A cornered wolf is the most savage. The summons came not as a threat, but as a desecration. On a Saturday evening, as Gabriel was preparing for evening mass, he found it. The tabernacle, the holy vault containing the consecrated Eucharist, had been pried open. The sacred hosts were scattered across the floor like discarded litter. And in the center of the altar, where the body of Christ should have been, sat a single gleaming bullet and a cell phone. He picked up the phone. It rang instantly. He answered. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve, brother." Marco's voice was strained, the silken arrogance replaced by a ragged fury. "This is between you and me, Marco. Leave the church out of it. Leave them out of it." "They are the reason for this," Marco roared over the line. "You chose them. You chose strangers and a dead God over your own blood. You took everything from me. The protection, the business, our father's legacy. Father's legacy was honor, not poisoning children for profit." "Honor is power," Marco screamed, "and you have taken mine. So now, I will take what is yours. Come and face me, Gabriele. No bodyguards, no guns, just you and me, in our house of God. Let's see which of us he favors. Or are you a coward as well as a traitor?" "Where?" Gabriel asked, his voice cold and steady. "Here, in your sanctuary, midnight. Come alone, or tomorrow morning your parishioners will find their beloved church has been cleansed by fire." The line went dead. Gabriel knew what he had to do. This was the end of the long road that had begun in a rainy alley in Naples. He spent the next few hours in prayer, but it was not a prayer for guidance. It was a prayer of confession and farewell. He was asking forgiveness not for what he was about to do, but for who he was and for the life he could never escape. He was confessing the sin of his own existence. He did not go to the police. This was beyond their laws. This was a matter of blood and soul. At 1:45, he put on his simple black cassock. He took the rosary from his pocket and placed it on his desk. Then he went to the footlocker and retrieved the Beretta. He tucked it into the waistband at the small of his back, the cold metal of familiar and terrible comfort against his skin. His cassock concealed it completely. He was a priest armed for a different kind of sacrament. He walked into the darkened nave of St. Michael's. The air was cold, smelling of desecration and dread. The only light came from the single sanctuary lamp, its eternal red flame flickering like a wounded heart. Marco was there, as promised. He was sitting on the high altar, a bottle of Macallan 25 in one hand, Gabriel's Beretta resting beside him on the sacred marble. He had violated the Holy of Holies, turning it into his personal throne room. He looked disheveled, his perfect suit wrinkled, his eyes wild with a potent cocktail of rage, paranoia, and sorrow. "The prodigal brother returns," Marco slurred, raising the bottle in a mock toast. "Come to deliver the final judgment?" Gabriel walked slowly down the center aisle, his soft-soled shoes making no sound. The faces of the saints in the stained glass windows were dark, silent witnesses. "This has to end, Marco. It ended the day you ran away." Marco slid off the altar, staggering slightly. He was drunk, but the gun in his hand was steady. "It ended the day you chose them over me. The day our father's shield chose to hide behind a cross. I did it to save my soul." "Your soul?" Marco laughed, a broken, desperate sound. "You have no soul, Gabriele. You are a killer, just like me, just like father. You just dress it up in fancy robes and call it righteousness." He gestured wildly with the gun. "Our father taught me to protect this family. He taught me to be strong. You taught me to be ruthless. I am what you made me." "I know," Gabriel said, his voice aching with a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical wound. He stopped a dozen feet from the altar. "And I have prayed every day for God to forgive me for that." "There is no forgiveness for us," Marco whispered, his bravado crumbling, revealing the lost little boy beneath. "You were supposed to protect me. You promised." "I am, Marco," Gabriel said, taking another step. "I am protecting you now. From yourself." Tears streamed down Marco's face, mingling with the sweat and the whiskey. "Liar!" he screamed, raising the gun, his hand trembling. "You betrayed me! You betrayed our blood!" In that instant, as Marco's finger tightened on the trigger, time seemed to slow. Gabriel saw not the monster his brother had become, but the 12-year-old boy in the back of a car, terrified, looking to him for salvation. He saw the woman in the alley in Naples. He saw Leo, beaten and bloody on his church floor, and he knew there was no other way. This was his penance, his sacrifice. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his own weapon. He simply looked at his brother, his eyes filled not with hate, but with an agonizing love. The gunshot was deafening in the sacred space, a cannon blast that shattered the silence and the stained glass image of the Lamb of God behind the altar. Gabriel did not fall. Marco did. He stared at his brother, a look of utter shock on his face, then looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his own chest. His gun clattered to the marble floor. Gabriel's Beretta, the one he had concealed, was now in his hand, a thin wisp of smoke curling from its barrel. He had fired through his cassock. A single, perfect shot. The shepherd had struck down the wolf. Gabriel rushed forward, catching his brother as he crumpled. He slid to the floor, cradling Marco's head in his lap. The smell of cordite and blood filled the air, a profane incense. "Gabriele!" Marco choked, his eyes searching his brother's face. "Why?" "Because I taught you to be a soldier," Gabriel whispered, his own tears falling onto his brother's face. "But I never taught you how to stop." A flicker of understanding, of peace passed through Marco's eyes. His body went limp. A final, ragged breath escaped his lips. And then, he was gone. For a long time, Gabriel knelt there, holding the body of his brother in the ruins of his sanctuary. The red sanctuary light cast a hellish glow on the scene. Finally, with movements that felt impossibly heavy, he laid Marco gently on the floor before the altar. He stood, walked to the altar, and placed his Beretta beside the crucifix. The gun and the cross, his two faiths, his two curses. The first rays of dawn began to filter through the shattered stained glass window, a new light falling upon the scene of old grief. Gabriel sank to his knees, the cold marble biting into his flesh. He made the sign of the cross, his hand trembling. His voice was a broken whisper, a prayer to a God he wasn't sure was still listening, a confession to the silent, empty church. Forgive me, Father, for I've saved them in the only way I knew.